Resuming debate, the honourable member Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank my colleagues. It's been interesting to hear some of the debate here so far today. And part of that, of course, is what I'm hearing on the floor, addressing a new bill before Parliament here. It's an important new bill, Bill S5, an act to amend the Canadian Environmental Protection Act 1999 to make related amendments to the Food and Drugs Act and to repeal the perfluorooctane sulfonate Virtual Elimination Act. So these are important environmental considerations for Parliament to consider here. Updating a bill that was initially passed, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, back in 1999 is well past due. And I understand from my colleague here, although I didn't know it before he spoke in the House today, that it's been 5 years since this bill has been under review. 5 years is a long time. Of course, 5 years was interrupted by 2 elections in the meantime, one of which was completely unnecessary and, of course, changed the entire legislative agenda so that we couldn't address these things in ample time here in this place, which is supposed to be looking at legislation in Canada and how we can do better at what's put on the agenda here. This bill, as my colleague pointed out, came over to us initially, was passed at the Senate with many amendments. And so we, in this case, seem to be the chamber of sober second thought on what has been brought to us as an amendment to the Environmental Protection Act. And everybody wants, of course, all Canadians want a strong Environmental Protection Act to make sure that the substances that are being transmitted in society actually do have some very clear guidelines around how they are going to be approved by the regulatory process. And make no mistake, there are good things about this bill. There are good things about this bill that I support, that I'm hoping to get into some committee work and really go through the detail here on some of the changes that were required, some of the changes required to be undone by some of the amendments that were put in place in the Senate on this that actually serve to move this legislation backwards as opposed to forwards. But what does work in this bill is getting rid of some of the redundancy in regulations. And you'll know, Madam Speaker, in this House, I've spoken many times about the weight of government, the weight of regulations, and how overlap in those, not just between different levels of government, as in provinces, municipalities, and federal government, but also within the government itself, those combination of looking at the same regulations through various different departments is a waste of time and a waste of money and a waste of effort for the companies that have to go through that process. So obviously dealing with those in one fell swoop, as this legislation seems to propose, is a better way of getting past regulations that industry has to go through in order to move things forward. And I will point out very clearly, Madam Speaker, that I've been involved in bills in this House of Commons where we did expedite things very clearly. I remember my work with the previous Minister of Natural Resources in the last Parliament, the 43rd Parliament, where we moved forward on regulatory advancements that were required in the offshore for regulating workers and making sure they stayed safe. And this was work that had been delayed for years. And as a result, offshore workers in Canada, Newfoundland, but primarily Newfoundland, but also Nova Scotia, regulations were not on top of each other anymore, and as a result there was a legal void as to what would happen in an accident. Well, the minister at that point in time, a very good minister, he and I worked together behind the scenes and made sure that we advanced that as quickly as possible, got it through this House and over to the other place, and actually I stand corrected, it actually came from the other place, and we got it through this House as quickly as possible, through committee, because we'd addressed everything that needed to be addressed in that legislation. And having that as legislation not available at that point in time was putting workers at risk. So when things need to move quickly in this House, Madam Speaker, we move them quickly, and that's our job, to make sure we look at what's best for Canadians and address what needs to be changed in legislation brought before us. Now I'm going to talk about this legislation a little bit because there are some clear deficiencies as well. There are some good things, as I've noted, in this bill, and we do need an updated Environmental Protection Act, and this also brings in other changes to other legislation as well. But there are some things that I had questions about because I have questions of a lot of the bureaucraties that we address here in the House of Commons. The language in this bill identifies certain things that I know are going to require further definition down the road. And those are things like vulnerable populations. Well, can we define what a vulnerable population is? Because I haven't seen it prescribed anywhere in legalese. We talk about the principles of non-regression and the principle of intergenerational equity. All of these things are nice concepts on paper, and yet they have no standing in any court of law because they haven't been in front of any court of law. And that's one of the problems here, is we can put these things on paper, and then all of a sudden somebody will actually challenge them, and they'll be in front of a judge that, as my colleague said earlier here, a judge doesn't get to look at the preamble of a bill, he only looks at the bill. And all of a sudden he goes, so this intergenerational equity thing is something profound, and here's the ruling I have in that. And that, of course, will layer its way up to every court in Canada, and then we'll have a ruling by the Supreme Court of Canada on what is meant by intergenerational equity, to say nothing of the intergenerational inequity that this government has visited upon Canadians repeatedly over the last 7 years. The amount of deficits that we've incurred in this government and foisting taxes upon future generations of Canadians is the definition of intergenerational inequity. Our kids, our grandkids, our great-grandkids are going to be looking after bills that this government refuses to pay today. So those are things that are going to have to find their way through in the wash, and it's better we find that wash here than 10 years later after several court iterations and several millions of dollars through our court system, and then, of course, have to back out everything that's been done over that time. We talked about toxicity in this bill. I recall not so long ago they talked about plastics being toxic. I know the plastics industry was very upset about that because I used Tupperware last night. I used a baggie this morning. So the issue is that toxic? Am I using toxic goods? And I think we really have to get towards what toxicity actually means for the communities that we are actually on. And a watch list for these substances it becomes capable of being overused and misunderstood by the bureaucrats and the legalists that might get involved with it. There are other definitions in here, like the right to a healthy environment. And I am all for healthy environments. I think everybody knows that. How we put that into right, as far as Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, is a mystery to me. But the right to a healthy environment, and I know that a lot of my colleagues think a healthy environment looks like a golf course. It's not at all the case. Healthy environment is actually something where you've got a whole bunch of bugs, if you will. We start at the very basic level here, and things move their way through the ecosystem, but sometimes nature in its healthy environment phase isn't pretty. You take a look at the agriculture that we produce in Canada. That agriculture, quite frankly, is a manipulation of nature, which I'm not sure if you looked at this and somebody couldn't challenge it, somebody could say, well, that's making an environment unhealthy because you're plowing a field that's killing a whole bunch of moles, voles, insects, birds, nests, everything else, in order, of course, to feed the world, which Canada does very well. So I do get challenged by some of this terminology that we have in here. We need to balance all this, of course, against social and economic factors and make sure we've got risk assessments and risk management profiles that actually show exactly what we're trying to accomplish here and balance it with what's good for all of society. One of the other issues on here, of course, that we've seen in regulatory overreach that we've seen in many government bills in their regulatory approach is the ability for anybody to request a minister to look to see if a substance is toxic. Now, there are all kinds of nuances going on in our court system currently in Canada where that is being abused by many organizations that are trying to stall developments in Canada. This opens the door to more of the same. And once we start opening the door to more of the same in every measure of society, we are going to have nothing but litigation from self-interested entities all the way through our legal system. That's what has to stop. That's what has to move forward a little better here and make sure we get better legislation for all Canadians. Those are my main points here, Madam Speaker, and I know my time is running quickly, but I am looking forward for the government to consider about how we actually make some good recommendations here, some good amendments so that this bill and the terms around it, the definitions that we're talking about, are addressed clearly, and we can address a good legislation for Canadians going forward here. And I'm open to questions and discussions further in this democratic process. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, it's interesting. The Conservatives are criticizing this government because the Senate is assisting us on some very important legislation. Yet Stephen Harper had no problem doing the same thing. In fact, he's even brought forward environmental legislation himself through the Senate. So when they talk about the use of the Senate in incorporating for a legislative agenda, they need to reflect it while they look in a mirror. Madam Speaker, the legislation that we have before us has been here since February through the Senate, passed through the Senate in June. We've introduced it long ago. If every member speaks on the legislation, it'll never pass. When does the Conservative Party want to actually see legislation such as this actually pass? Why not allow it to pass into committee where stakeholders and other MPs can contribute to the debate and discussion?
Member for Calgary Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for a good question there. I want to ask him, or I'll put it back to him because I know it's not my place to ask him. I don't recall criticizing the government for moving this agenda through the Senate first. I said that this time we are the body in the House of Commons of sober second thought. And I know that my colleague on the side, it might be second thought. I mean, we're trying to be sober here, make sure we actually do put some analysis into this, not just ram it through like my colleague on the other side would like us to do. I'm a member of the Environment Committee. I know where this is going to end up. It's going to be on my desk. And I've already put some effort into looking at this bill and how we address changes in it that are going to be required going forward here. So we are going to make sure that we get this bill. I would challenge him on making sure that if it took 5 years to get here, why jamming it through here in 10 minutes is, if he'd like, is his approach, if that would be appropriate. I think we do need to address these things, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank another member from Calgary for his speech, and I just wanted to add some comments to his concerns around how this idea of the right for Canadians to live in a healthy and clean environment would be approached. In this bill we are debating today, S5, the new Canadian Environmental Protection Act, would only extend those rights as far as the bill goes. So it'll be basically around toxins and air pollution and water pollution. The federal government has a wider mandate than that. We have a lot of environmental legislation on the books, the Fisheries Act, the Species at Risk Act, and I'm just wondering if he would agree that we need to extend that right to the entire federal mandate.
The Honourable for Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I really appreciate the questions from my colleague who I sat on committee with in the last Parliament, and he always has some excellent input into the manner in which we need to move legislation forward. Let me say that this whole issue around a clean and healthy environment is a great concept, and I fully subscribe to it. And at the same time, I look at this nonsense that I hear in this House from members in this House, and not the member in question here, but I do need to make sure that we've got clarity on what we're trying to accomplish here. I've heard many times at committee and in this House about how the emissions from oil and gas, for instance, are actually causing people to limit their lifespan. However, you look at the increasing lifespan of Canadians, it's significant. We've actually done very well with lower cost energy and very lower and lower emissions in this country. I want to make sure we continue on that. The Canadians' lifespans and morbidity continues to increase. We actually make sure we get better and expect more from our legislation around how we treat Canadians. That's what I'm after here, Madam Speaker. Thank you.
Brief question. The Honourable Member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
Oh, thank you, Madam Speaker. And Honourable friend from Calgary Centre. I'm certainly very concerned that this bill not be rushed through, and I agree with him insofar as that comment. This is a very complex bill. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act is a very long act in 6 parts. The government has chosen not to review or update Part 6 at all, which deals with marine dumping and genetically modified organisms. That section needs attention, but will be outside the scope of the act for parliamentarians to review unless the government steps up and says we need to modernize this section as well. And I'm also concerned about protecting this bill from court challenges, and we need to put back in list of toxic substances, Schedule A.
Brief answer from the member for Calgary Centre.
I share my colleagues' concerns about how we actually get things done in this House and make sure that we actually address legislation quickly. One of the issues in this bill, of course, is that Canadian Environmental Protection Act is a criminal act. So we are moving a lot of addresses here towards a criminal approach to things with a lower bar, a more civil law bar about how those are approached. So we're actually impacting two sets of law here that might not serve Canadian society well. These are some things we have to consider in this, and I'm open to everything my colleague has to say about how we make this better. Thank you.
Resuming debate.